So if I'm being perfectly honest, I was actually a little bit disappointed by Hitman, as I was expecting so much more from this movie, especially after all of the press that Glen Powell was doing for this film. And I just feel like ultimately I have just seen so many better dark comedy movies, and the majority of this film, from my perspective, was actually pretty dull, and it was only really saved by Glen Powell's really charismatic performance along with the final act of this movie. And if you do like slow burn movies, then fair enough, Hitman does deliver. But for me, I just expected to enjoy this movie from start to finish. And like I said, even though the ending is pretty decent, I don't think that makes up for the fact that the majority of this movie, from my point of view, was actually pretty boring. What I do think is an interesting artistic decision is to make the aesthetic of this movie a blend of both the 80s and modern day, as of course the real life story that this movie is based upon actually is from the 80s, so I do think the way in which they did that was actually pretty cool. And speaking of that time period, I do think it's interesting the things that they actually took from the real life story and then the other things that they fabricated. So for example, the real life Gary was actually an undercover cop posing as a teacher instead of the other way around, which I thought was actually pretty interesting. And the second half of this movie is actually pretty much based on fiction, as there were certain things that took place. For example, there was a woman that was contemplating murdering her abusive partner, but then Gary did actually talk her out of it and actually recommended her to go to social services and to seek therapy. And so Glen Powell and the other producers took this and then kind of did a Marvel what if on it, in terms of what would have happened if Gary maybe fell in love with this woman and then embarked on a relationship with her, which is obviously then what then transpires for the rest of this movie. And another interesting question that is posed with this movie is, what is the real persona of Gary, as he just does such a good job in terms of playing all of these various different types of people, and actually does it in a really believable way. I mean, not only were the disguises actually pretty believable, which is probably a big testament to the real life Gary, and of course Glen Powell's brilliant acting ability. And by the way, there was actually a real life woman that did offer payment to Gary via a boat, which I thought was actually pretty hilarious. And this movie does kind of feel like a bit of an actor's playground, and they are kind of really enjoying themselves. Glen Powell in particular, as you can just tell, he is having an absolute blast making this movie. And of course you can look at it from a one-dimensional perspective in terms of, he is playing all of these different personas, but I actually quite like it when you dig a little bit deeper, and like I said, you really explore who is the real Gary, as he goes from this timid teacher with 2 cats to then being this ultra bad boy hitman type character. And I know at the end he's like, look, I do have a blend of both of them, and that is kind of the person that I have now become. But I do think it's a really interesting question. And it does kind of also show that really you can be anybody that you want to be. So you aren't really limited or restricted to the person that maybe you were growing up as literally you can be anyone that you want to be. And from a message point of view, I do actually think that's a pretty nice, empowering message to leave the audience with. I thought Adria Arjona was fine. I thought the relationship between her and Glen Powell's Gary character was pretty forced, and I couldn't really believe the chemistry between the two of them. If anything, I think she did a much better performance in the Father of the Bride reboot. I always thought that the character that Amelio was playing was actually really interesting, and I'm really glad that we saw so much more of him in the final act, as he was of course a bit of a rival police officer that Gary's character, he basically stole his life. So of course you can see and understand the rivalry that is now happening from Austin character's perspective in terms of wanting revenge. And I do actually think this is a really believable motivation. So as far as that character is concerned, not only was he a real thwart in Gary's plan, but I do actually think the way in which the final act then transpired, I do actually think was pretty impressive. And even though the killer twist, you can see it a mile off, I do actually think the way in which everything then ended up taking place was actually really, really good. And they do have that Hollywood happily ever after type ending, which I think is pretty funny. And I know a lot of people, James Gunn for example, does say it's all about how you leave a person right at the end. But like I said, for me, I just expected so much more, and I want to enjoy myself across the entire movie, not only just at the end. And so for all of those reasons, I'm going to give Hitman a 3 out of 10. Now I'd love to hear from you. What did you think of this movie? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video.